Okay, we would like to resume our program, so if you would take seats, those of you who are standing, and we'll get started. Let me ask a question, first of all. How many of you were at the reception last night when we talked about the green? Okay, so there is a connection between last night and our keynote. Franklin Roosevelt once said, in human affairs, the public must be offered a drama. And I think last night we had the last big Social Security drama, the Greenspan Commission of 1982 and the Social Security amendments of 1983 that came out of it. There have been some intermittent other acts of a minor nature, but I think the theme this afternoon is, are we ready for the next big act in the drama known as Social Security policy and politics in the United States? We are thrilled that Henry Aaron, with the Brookings Institution, a founding board member of the National Academy of Social Insurance, a former board chair, really came and asked if the Academy would be the venue for his proposal. And I was absolutely thrilled that Henry looked at the Academy as a worthy venue. So we're thrilled that he's decided to do this. And then Nancy Altman, who was also a founding board member of the Academy, a recent board member, and now the head of Social Security Works, will be one of our discussants. Jason Fichtner, who is a new member of the board of the National Academy of Social Insurance and on the faculty of the Mercatus Center, will also offer some comments. But I do want to say a few words about Henry, even though he asked me not to, but I told him, stop me, Henry. I have to go back to 30 years ago when we started the National Academy of Social Insurance. We were part of the founding board. And as I've told many of you in the past, I really was in awe of this group that I was in the midst of. But they really broke down into three categories. You had the founding fathers, as I would call them. You had Robert Ball. You had Bob Myers, Wilbur Cohen. I mean, these were legends. And we're in their midst, and I'm in awe of them. And they were clearly the movers and shakers. Then you had the middle echelon of rising stars, individuals had already established their bona fides, and they were clearly moving to the next echelon. And I put Henry in that category. Larry Thompson, I would say, was in that category. Mert Bernstein. Elizabeth Wickenden, probably more likely in the former category, but she was also one of the unsung heroines of social insurance in our country, finally called Wiki. And then there was a group of us, the newbies. Nancy, Eric Kingston. Is Eric here? He was, I know I just saw him. He had to step out. Eric, who was on our panel, was a newbie, and I was a newbie. I was really a newbie. I mean, Nancy and Eric had some established Social Security credentials and writing, but I had really done very, very little and constantly wondering, why am I here? What am I doing here? But thrilled to be in their company. So we would have a lot of meetings. We had an organizing committee, and then we had the board. We'd have a lot of meetings. Now, I get a phone call one day from Henry. He goes, Bill, I was supposed to give a presentation next week to a bunch of pension thought leaders in St. Louis, and I have a conflict. I'd like you to speak instead of me. Now, I must say, I was in awe of Henry and the thought that he would come to me and ask me to speak on his behalf. And I guess I couldn't hide my emotion. And Henry said, don't get too carried away, Bill. He said, the way I decided, I looked at our list of founding board members, and I just went in alphabetical order. And Nancy Altman said, I can't do it, Henry. So I was next. But I show up in St. Louis. I think I did a credible enough job because Henry never called me and said, boy, I'll never do that again, Bill. But I couldn't help but then tell everybody who I knew. I went to St. Louis, and I pinch hit for Hank Aaron. And I milked that one for many years thereafter. So we're very thrilled that Henry has agreed again to present his proposal. He'll present, we'll have discussions. Start thinking of questions now, because I have a feeling this is going to generate a lot of questions. So please use your cards, and then we'll have as many questions as we could possibly address answered. So Henry, I'll turn it to you.
I want to thank Bill Arnone very much for giving me the privilege of being able to talk to you today. I have to say that along with the story that you just told, I have to share with you that I have been asked to sign baseballs. I was invited to a celebrity golf tournament by Miss America, and I saw the face of a chauffeur driver crumple more than I've seen any face crumple when I arrived and he looked at me. I'd like to start today by telling you where I'm coming from and what I'm going to be trying to do. I'm going to be wearing two hats today. First, as a policy analyst, I've been studying Social Security for a very long time. And second, as a political progressive who believes that Social Security has served Americans superlatively for 80 years, and that with some relatively minor adjustments, it can and will continue to do so for the indefinite future. I'm going to try and persuade you that political progressives should push Social Security to the front of the political debate as soon as the political environment makes possible an acceptable deal to establish sustainable solvency. And I'm going to lay out what I think their opening position should be in that debate. So I'll be speaking both as an analyst and as a political advocate. For the last 35 years, the trustees have reported that Social Security is going to be unable to pay at least some scheduled benefits sometime in the middle third of the 21st century. For almost that long, the Congressional Budget Office has warned that the overall federal budget deficit is on an unsustainable trajectory. Some people, mostly conservatives, say that these projections prove that the United States can no longer afford to sustain Social Security, Medicare, and other so-called entitlements. Some openly acknowledge that by touting entitlement crisis, they hope to cultivate a base willing to scale back or even replace Social Security. So far, at least, that campaign has failed legislatively. But the game isn't over, and talk of crisis has made a lot of people very nervous. Roughly 2/3 of the American public tell pollsters that Social Security is in a state of crisis or faces major problems. Smaller majorities say they don't expect to receive some or all currently scheduled Social Security benefits. At the same time, very solid majorities of progressives, conservatives, and independents alike all say that Social Security is important to them and even that they're willing to pay more in taxes to sustain it. Now, most of you, if I can make this clicker work, which is in doubt, there we go, most of you will recognize this chart. It comes from the 2017 annual report of the Social Security trustees. It illustrates in picture form the long-term Social Security financing gap measured as a share of payroll. And it shows that some adjustment is going to be made, have to be made over the long run. That wiggly, heavy, solid line on the left that drops down in 2034 to become the flat, heavy line, that line shows, that flat line shows the benefits that can be paid and the wiggly line up to it with accumulated reserves and projected revenues. The wavy dashed line that's floating above that shows scheduled benefits. The difference between them, the wavy and the solid lines, after 2034, portrays the projected gap between reserves plus projected current law revenues on the one hand, and the cost of scheduled benefits on the other, again, as a percent of taxable payroll. To close that gap in 2034 without raising taxes at all would take an abrupt benefit cut in that year of 23% and somewhat more cuts later on. Now, will projections be off? Of course they're going to be off. So SSA now prepares so-called stochastic projections that show how variations in key assumptions might cause the depletion date to vary. And do analysts criticize how the actuaries are doing these estimates? Of course they do. But the takeaway is, in my opinion, indisputable. Trust fund depletion may come a bit earlier or a bit later than 2034, but if nothing at all is done, come it will. Not only that, the imbalance unfolds, there we go. The imbalance unfolds fast, and it comes soon. Nearly all of the average 75-year actuarial gap opens up between now and 2035. By then, almost all of the boomers will have claimed benefits, and then after that, for a couple of decades, the gap is actually projected to shrink a bit because the large baby boom cohorts are going to be dying off and replaced by smaller age cohorts that succeed them. After that, expenditures once again begin to rise. The gap increases, but very, very slowly. The funding gap is projected to grow 3.5 times more by 2035, that's 17 years from now, than it will over the succeeding 57 years. So, what should Congress do, and when should they do it? The answer to these questions is inescapably political. Progressives and conservatives both must ask themselves what they want to have happen and whether legislating early or late is more likely to give them what they want. So where are the parties now? Well, the answer to that is about as far apart as they possibly could be. Sam Johnson, the Republican chair of the Social Security Subcommittee of Ways and Means, and Representative John Larson, the ranking Democrat on the same committee, have each introduced bills. Each would close the long-term funding gap. Each would achieve sustainable solvency. But that's where the similarity pretty much ends. Johnson's bill would do so entirely by cutting benefits, and in fact, he'd cut benefits more than enough to close the projected gap, letting him propose tax cuts as well. In contrast, Larson's bill would close the gap entirely by raising taxes, and he would raise taxes more than enough to close the gap so that he could also raise benefits. Not a lot of common ground here. On the question of when the gap should be closed, the prevailing view, I think, in both parties seems to be not now, and of course, it's always now. So most of the informed observers I know think that nothing much is going to be done until the trust fund depletion is imminent. In fact, I would guess that that's what most of you think too. And you may be right. Now, in addition to that, most progressive analysts I know go even further. That's what they hope for. Why? Because closing the gap entirely, or even mostly, on the expenditure side when the trust funds are nearly empty would be just too brutal. A 23% across-the-board cut is bad enough, but if Congress wants to spare those already retired or already disabled, the cuts for new claimants would have to be considerably larger. Surely, the argument runs, Congress would be driven to boost payroll taxes rather than hammer the elderly and people with disabilities. Those of you who were here last night heard Bruce Schobel articulate exactly that position. Most progressives, I think, would then react and say, well, that's just fine. Tax increases rather than benefit cuts to close the funding gap, that's just what we'd like, so let's wait. And I'll bet again, not a few of you here, along with Bruce Schobel last night, believe exactly that. My message, perhaps my primary message today, is that that line of argument is wrong. Even more, I believe it is dangerously wrong from the standpoint of progressives, and here's why. Congress, in fact, can cut benefits, long-run benefits, all they want, and yet they can spare current beneficiaries and those soon to become beneficiaries. And how can they do that? Simply by borrowing to permit benefit reductions to be phased in over many years. We have some examples. The partial privatization plans fashioned during the George W. Bush administration would have done exactly that. Those plans would have used government borrowing to sustain current benefits, and while payroll taxes were diverted into private accounts. But one needn't go to hypothetical plans that failed. The current administration and Congress just showed that generous transfers, they're called tax cuts, mostly to the comparatively well-to-do, can be financed by borrowing. And that brings me to the second reason why I think it's wrong to believe that delay necessarily favors the progressives' agenda. No one can know which party is going to be dominant in the 2030s. Once political balance is restored, in my view, progressives will be playing Russian roulette if they embrace a policy of delay with a program that is as precious to us as Social Security. Those who believe, as I do, that Social Security is a policy treasure should force a national debate on restoring balance to the system as soon as it is possible to achieve an acceptable deal to restore sustainable balance. Now, I understand that's not going to be during 2018, and it probably won't be during the rest of the current presidential administration. But in my view, progressives should prepare now to push a national debate on Social Security financing and structural reforms as soon as possible after the 21 elections. And not, I would say, by going to sleep until then. Now is the time to agree on a plan for action. Now is the time to commit to its enactment. I want to use the remainder of my time first to list some rather major post-1983 developments that signal the need for modest but important changes in Social Security, and second, to lay out a program for restoring Social Security to enduring financial balance that can serve as a template for negotiation. The first major development is obvious. In 1983, we had 75 years until it looked like the trust fund was going to run out of money. Now, depletion is projected to occur in 16 years. Preventing that from happening is job one. 16 years to act is hardly a crisis, but it is this generation's challenge, not the next's. Almost as important, in my view, is that we not repeat the mistake made in 1983. Emerging imbalance was built into the 1983 deal. Even if every single assumption that the actuaries used during their 1983 projections had been spot on, no mistakes, everything tracked history. Even so, the funding gap projected today on those assumptions would be 2/3 as large as the one that we're actually looking at. Second, earnings inequality has intensified dramatically since 1983. Now, as in 1983, the same proportion of workers, about 94%, have all their earnings covered by the payroll tax. But the proportion of total earnings above the taxable maximum has nearly doubled from 10% in 1983 to 17.5% in 2015. Third, life expectancy has increased, but very unevenly. Consider the following finding, courtesy of my colleagues Gary Burtless and Barry Bosworth. Among people born in 1920 who lived to age 50, those in the top income decile lived 5 years longer than people in the bottom income decile. Among people born in 1940, 20 years later, the gap widened to about 11 years. That widening longevity gap has significantly eroded the Social Security progressivity measured over the life cycle. Fourth, disposable Social Security benefits, the checks that people get to cash, have lagged behind total worker compensation for 3 reasons. The 1983 legislation reduced replacement rates for most retirees. Medicare premiums have risen faster than earnings and benefits, and they're subtracted before Social Security benefit checks are cut. And a growing share of worker compensation comes in the form of employer-financed health insurance and other untaxed fringe benefits. The fifth development is the nearly complete replacement of private sector traditional defined benefit pensions by 401k plans. And I have to say, if Roz Chast does anything relevant to anything I want to talk about, I want to include her cartoons. Now, experts disagree on whether this swap is on balance, a good thing or a bad thing. But there's no doubt that it places more risk on individual workers. And more risk boosts the importance of the lifetime inflation-protected annuity that Social Security almost uniquely provides. Finally, one structural element of Social Security once made more sense than it does. No, before I come to that, this is the fact that on balance, I'm sorry. The special minimum benefit, which was put into effect a couple of decades back, 2 or 3 decades back, to serve people with long, low-wage careers, has ceased now to apply to any new applicants because of the gap between indexing provisions. The one structural element of Social Security once made more sense than it does now. Once upon a time, most couples were legally married, and most supplied one person to the paid labor force. In that world, the spouse benefit made sense. As married men and women today now work at nearly the same rates, the spouse benefit makes sense to an ever-diminishing extent. The proportion of women who receive benefits based on their own earnings rose 20 percentage points between 1998 and 2016, and that proportion is headed up still further. It's over 60% now. Yet women, on the other hand, continue to shoulder most of the economic and career costs of childbearing and child rearing, and Social Security does not adequately recognize that contribution. So Let me go back a step. Things are a bit out of order here. Actually, the slides are out of order. I'm going to talk about it and leave the slides aside. I'm going to describe the program, which consists of 11 specific proposals. The first 4 of them help to restore the progressivity that has been lost over the last generation. These changes involve steepening the progressivity of the Social Security benefit formula. Second, gradually increasing the earnings ceiling to cover 90% of covered earnings. Third, broaden the tax base to include rapidly growing and currently untaxed elements of compensation. And last, to increase the special minimum benefit, which was intended to help lifetime low earners, but which now serves no one at all. Before going to the next point, which I will do in a second, I want to tell you I have a more detailed sheet that's on the table outside. If you want to look at it when I'm done, you can pick it up, and it describes everything in at least somewhat more detail. The fifth element of the program at long last would be to make Social Security coverage truly universal, which means to cover all jobs, public and private. The sixth element would provide child care dropout years for one parent of either sex who takes time out for the paid labor force to raise children. And the seventh would cap and price index the spouse benefit. The eighth and ninth provisions would provide a capped benefit that would increase to people who have been on benefit increase to people who have been on the beneficiary rolls for an extended period of time, and would lift the age until which dependent children who are in school would remain eligible for benefits. Now, in combination, those 9 changes that I've just listed so far nearly balance Social Security on the average for the next 75 years, but they don't quite make it. And they miss by a pretty wide margin in the later years. The reason being that costs are projected to rise as the baby boomers retire and as average longevity keeps on, we hope, going up. So the final 2 items in the program are added revenues. An immediate earmark of revenues from the estate and gift tax at 2017 rates. Yes, the program calls for rolling back the just enacted exemption on the estate and gift tax. And it includes payroll tax increases later on. So let me see if I can carry through to the slide that shows the summary of all of this. Here it is. It's a summary of the impact of the program on balance of all of these changes taken together. As I say, there are copies of more detail are available on the table outside. They are not official estimates. I freely admit, availed myself of Steve Goss's great kindness in providing counsel, and he assures me that I'm reasonably close, but as I said, they're not official. And they are calculated as if the program takes effect immediately, but as I said before, we all know that no immediate action is going to be taken. By 2021, the earliest date when action might be feasible, the numbers will have changed. So the specifics would have to be tweaked in order to achieve overall sustainable balance. So this program relies mostly, but not exclusively, on new revenues to close the funding gap. It's no secret that conservative opposition to raising taxes is strong and it's deep. And Senate rules expose Social Security legislation to filibuster. So I think it exceedingly unlikely that either party is going to win a complete victory. But the program I've described, and that's outlined in more detail on that sheet, I believe provides a position from which progressives can effectively negotiate. Yes, it's true, procrastination may continue until the trust funds are nearly depleted. But again, delay does not serve the interests of those who value Social Security, nor does it serve those who embrace a larger progressive legislative agenda. No one can know what the balance of political forces is going to be when the trust funds are depleted. But there are some things we do know. We do know that with the passage of time, the size of the projected financial gap in Social Security will grow. We do know that the gap enables those opposing progressive legislation to continue ringing the alarm of unsustainable deficits and to invoke entitlement crisis to warn fence-sitters of the unaffordability of all manner of progressive legislation. That's why I believe supporters of progressive legislation in all fields should take the initiative and press aggressively to restore long-term Social Security balance, financing balance. The time to act is when political balance is restored. That's not likely to come until 2021, but now is the time for progressives to design their position, and now is the time for them to commit to leading a debate on how to restore to enduring financial balance America's most popular and important domestic program. Thank you very much.
In addition to providing cash benefits, Social Security, as its name suggests, is intended to provide security, peace of mind. But polling shows, and Henry mentioned, that most non-retired Americans believe that they will get no Social Security whatsoever. Now, we in this room all know that Congress would have to repeal Social Security for insured workers and their families to get no benefits at all. Social Security legislation is necessary but not sufficient to restore confidence. Open, extensive hearings, markups, and a value-based debate in Congress are also necessary. You're right, this is sensitive. There we go. The question whether to expand Social Security, cut it, or enact some combination of the two is a matter of values, not affordability. An expanded Social Security is absolutely affordable. As this slide shows, Social Security will cost only about 1% of GDP more at the end of the century than it costs today. As this slide shows, other industrialized countries today spend a much greater percentage of their GDP on their counterpart programs than we're projected to spend in year 2100 and beyond. Failure to have an open conversation where we all agree on basics doesn't just make debate harder. It cuts off discussion of important issues. The Greenspan Commission, which largely developed the 1983 amendments, understood that the 1990s would be a low-cost period because the Depression era and World War II cohorts, a low birth rate group, would be retiring, and the baby boom would be in its peak earning years. The question at the time was whether to reduce FICA in the 1990s and raise it thereafter, or keep it at the same rate and build up a sizable reserve. Policymakers chose the latter. That left open the question whether to maintain the reserve once it had built and so partially shift to advance funding, where investment income would help fund Social Security going forward, or draw the reserve down to pay for the baby boom and return to current funding, which was the way Social Security was financed for most of its history. That's a question that should have been a focus of debate well before now. But the same forces that have convinced a majority of Americans that Social Security won't be there have stifled that debate with a double bind. If Social Security's investment income is just a gimmick, worthless IOUs, the government paying itself, advance funding is no good. And if current funding is a Ponzi scheme, unfair to future generations, creates unfunded liabilities, it's no good either. That catch-22 makes reasoned debate impossible. In addition to understanding that Social Security is affordable, it is imperative to recognize that though solvency is important, it is simply a means to an end, the end of providing economic security. That's the goal. Henry recognizes, as do many of us, that with the disappearance of defined benefit private pension plans, people will be more dependent on Social Security in the future. That's why Democrats are calling for expansion without cuts. Social Security's benefits are modest by virtually any measure, but Henry proposes to alter the benefit formula to increase benefits for some and reduce them for others. In doing so, he's playing with fire. As wage insurance, Social Security's benefits are related to wages. As this slide shows, the higher your insured wages, the larger your benefit. Henry's proposal compresses that fundamental structure, but other leading proposals using the same levers radically alter it. Here's Henry's description of his proposal on his fact sheet. Quote, increased progressivity of benefit formula, raise replacement rate at bottom, lower it at the top. Here's how Bowles-Simpson describes their proposal. Quote, the commission proposes gradually moving to a more progressive benefit formula that slows future benefit growth, particularly for higher earners. Here's what Representative Johnson says about his plan. Quote, modernizing how benefits are calculated to increase benefits for lower income workers while slowing the growth for higher income workers. And here's what President Bush said about his progressive price indexing proposal. Quote, I propose a system where benefits for low-income workers will grow faster than those that are better off, close quote. Bowles-Simpson, Johnson, and Bush smuggle in a radical policy change under cover of a simple solvency proposal. As this slide shows, those proposals would ultimately result in the lines converging or close to converging, providing relatively uniform low benefits largely unrelated to prior earnings. It's instructive to note that changing Social Security from wage-related insurance to a subsistence-level benefit unrelated to wages is not a new proposal. In fact, this is a change Republicans have sought since 1936. The 1936 Republican platform proposed repealing the just enacted Social Security and replacing it as follows, quote, every American citizen over 65 should receive the payment necessary to provide a minimum income sufficient to protect him or her from want. And a leading Republican congressman who opposed Social Security's expansion argued in 1950 that while Social Security relies on, quote, the concept that benefit amounts should vary directly with the worker's former wage level, it is my belief that benefits should be uniform in amount and independent of previous wage history. Cutting benefits through the benefit formula is particularly treacherous because even those of us in this room cannot understand the implications of mini PIAs, indexing formulae, bend point changes, percentage factors without careful study. There is no way that the public or even legislators could understand them without open hearings and discussion. With respect to other provisions in Henry's proposal, there's widespread agreement. Raising the special minimum, restoring student benefits, child care credits, birthday bump, changing the wage base, though many of us would go further. I'm delighted to see that Henry advocates dedicating the estate tax to Social Security. In light of the nation's income and wealth inequality, we should dedicate more progressive revenue to Social Security. And FICA increases well into the future that can be adjusted depending on circumstances is something that was done historically and is important to restoring confidence. About Henry's proposed change to spousal benefits, though. Spousal benefits are something that have been debated from the start. Indeed, an advisory council in 1937 briefly discussed recommending earnings sharing, where a couple's total earnings would be equally divided between the spouses. While excellent in theory, these proposals have serious distributional impacts. They increase poverty among divorced spouses and widows, groups with already disproportionately high rates of poverty. Discrimination and the failure to value family caregiving cause wives, on average, to have much lower lifetime earnings than their husbands. If wives earn the same as their husbands, Henry's proposal would not result in any savings. We should not be making changes that make women even more financially insecure. So let me conclude where I started. Whether to expand or cut Social Security is a matter of values. It is a question of politics in the best sense of the word, how we collectively choose to spend our wealth. Rather than those of us in Washington coming up with some closed-door financing deal, Democrats should run aggressively this year in 2018 on a platform of expanding, not cutting Social Security, and requiring millionaires and billionaires to pay more. Then, if Democrats win either or both chambers of Congress, they should immediately hold hearings on the economic insecurity of millions of Americans facing retirement and how expanding, not cutting Social Security, will address that insecurity. That, I believe, is the key to unlocking congressional action. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Again, I'm Jason Fichtner from the Mercatus Center, and also on the board of the Academy. Thank you for taking some time to be here today. This is a wonderful conference. And when I was originally asked to do this, to talk about Henry Aaron's progressive proposal, I was thinking of Shakespeare and how I have come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. And then I saw Hank's slides, and I thought, I'm going to switch this around. I've now come today to praise Hank Aaron, not to bury him. I want to leave comments on the specific proposals that Hank talked about for the discussion when we get to it. But I want to make some general comments and then make sure we have time to have a discussion on the proposals. So some general responses. The first thing I did when I read this was I went back to make sure it was Hank that sent it and not somebody else trying to spoof me. Because after I read it, my first thought was, thank you. We now have a self-proclaimed progressive that warns. Delaying action on Social Security does not serve those who embrace a progressive policy agenda. Make no mistake, if you delay, you are hurting the program. You can't count on favorable political forces at time of trust fund depletion, and depletion is coming. I think Hank undersells this, sort of saying you can't count on a political forces at time of depletion is the toss of a coin. Heads you win, tails you lose. Can we even count on a functioning political process in 2034 or 2035? We have not had a confirmed commissioner of Social Security in 5 years. I guarantee you it's probably going to be 6, given this election cycle that we're going to now. Are we going to have a functioning policy process to do something in 2034 if we don't start working on it now? Hank also points out the continued alarm over deficits, debt, and the quote-unquote entitlement crisis are having an effect on public perception, which can, and I think is, leading to less public support for the program. Delaying any sort of action or discussion of what we should do to reform the program and how we can make it stronger and better, both progressively, conservatively, and financially, only hurts our ability to do so in the long term. Hank also acknowledges this is our challenge, not our children. The longer we wait, the more we kick the can down the road onto our children or to our grandchildren. That's morally reprehensible. This is our problem. Let's fix it. Lastly, on this point, Hank acknowledges that we're going to have to make deals. A deal means compromise, which means there's some give and there's some take. You can't get it all. Neither side is going to be able to claim a complete victory. The only way we're going to get victory at all is to come together and find compromise. Second, progressives should push for Social Security to the front of the debate soon, but not until a policy environment allows for an acceptable deal. This is one of Hank's points. My question is, if not now, when? Do we really want to wait till 2011 to start putting together a debate on Social Security reform? The longer we delay, the greater the change in the revenue increases and/or benefit reductions needed just to maintain status quo scheduled benefits. This leaves little room for more progressive policy changes to Social Security. I've signed 3 Social Security trustees reports when I was at Social Security, 2007, 8, and 9. Steve has reminded me of this. In 2007, had we just lifted the maximum taxable on payroll taxes, we could have closed the Social Security solvency on a 75-year basis. That was in 2007. If we did it today, it covers at most 2/3. At most 2/3. We've lost some of our options. The longer we wait, the more our options decline, become 0. Do you want to have progressive policies that include parental leave? Do you want to even have discussions about long-term care supports? Guess what? That's off the table if you wait till 2034, because all revenues will be going towards trying to make Social Security solvent. There is no room for anything more for a progressive agenda if you wait until 2034. Third, why progressives shouldn't wait until trust fund depletion? Tax increases will not be raised enough to cover the shortfall. Don't fool yourself. A 3 or 4 percentage point increase doesn't sound like much when you put it that way, but from 12.4% to 15.4% to 16.4% is a 24 or 32% tax increase. You thought Republicans are great at labeling the estate tax a death tax? Just wait till we get our hands on this one. A 30% tax increase on labor? Good luck. That brings the FICA tax to about 19.3%. That's about a 20% payroll tax. Add on for some people 30, 35% federals, 10% for state or local. You're at a 60% marginal tax rate. It's not going to happen. No, benefits won't be cut in full. I guarantee you that's not politically acceptable. My mother is getting Social Security benefits. If they get cut 20%, she's going to call me and say, didn't you work for Social Security? Go get my money back. I guarantee you that's not going to happen. But that means we're going to have compromise. Does that mean it's 50-50? The Bipartisan Policy Center got a group of conservatives and liberals together to come to an agreement on what they could do for financial security. They kind of went with the 50-50 benefit reductions, tax increases. Is that where we're going, or is the split going to be 60-40 one way or the other? The point is there is going to be compromise. If you don't think there is, you're fooling yourselves. The longer we wait, the greater the magnitude of change required. Either way, there is no policy space for additional progressive policies if you wait. Henry Aaron doesn't say it, so I will. Why conservatives shouldn't wait until trust fund depletion. There are 2 or 3 of you in the audience, so I'm speaking to you. Kind of the same points. No, benefits won't get cut in full. If you think waiting means we're just going to let benefits be cut, boy, that's also being unrealistic. But again, there's going to be compromise. 50-50, 60-40, 70-30. The longer we wait, the less control we have over putting policy options forward that we all can come together with. And again, the longer we wait, the greater the magnitude of required change will go. Under any compromise agreement, I guarantee you revenues go up. That's what compromise means. So the longer we wait, the greater the tax increase is going to be, even under a compromise. So let's get together today and come to some sort of agreement. There'll also be no policy space, even for moderate conservative Social Security policies, if we wait longer. General revenue transfers. What that means is more deficits, more debt. I do remember a point in time. I know it seems like recent long-term history, but conservatives used to be the party of fiscal responsibility. No deficits, no debt. They were bad things. Now, who knows? But what we're seeing, and Nancy had on her slide, her second slide, what she had is affordability of Social Security. Basically, you get to about 2038, 2040, Social Security becomes 6% of GDP, and it continues about that way to 2080. That is a very, very powerful slide for complacency. You get the trust fund depletion, Democrats look at it, Republicans look at it and go, wow, that's 50 years of kicking the can down the road if all we do is do revenue, general revenue transfers and borrow more money. Then it's not our problem any longer. It's our kids' problems or our grandkids' problems. Politicians are very good at kicking the can down the road. We've seen, and Henry pointed this out, how willing they are to borrow money to finance political opportunities. This is the status quo. My guess is if we do nothing, it'll be general revenue transfers and borrowing to keep the status quo and to keep scheduled benefits paid. But that means there is no room for progressive policy agendas. There's no room for long-term care supports. There's no room for parental leave. There's no room for even partial privatization or add-on private accounts at that point. It's just trying to make Social Security whole at that point. There's nothing more. For those of you who love the movie Spaceballs, this is my last slide. When will then be now? Soon. We can't set the alarm clock for 2021, as Hank points out. For any plan to pass, it's going to have to be bipartisan and based off compromise. We have to lay the groundwork now. And I do mean we, everyone in this room. The mission of the National Academy of Social Insurance is to advance solutions to challenges facing the nation by increasing public understanding of how social insurance contributes to economic security. If this isn't the role for the Academy, what is? We put out reports, the three of us were on one that did for the transition report for the new president coming in. We did something on Social Security. I think we worked very well together. My guess is, given the membership here, there's probably a good at least 10 people, maybe 20 or 30, who would donate some time, even a small amount of time, to reviewing reports, proposals, comments. We put something together. Could you imagine if the Academy spent the next 2 years putting together a report we could find compromise on Social Security reform that then we could put forward as a group in 2020 and 2021 to basically try to have some impact on the next presidential debate and say, here's where a group from the National Academy of Social Insurance got together on a bipartisan basis and has recommendations. Make it part of the political debate then. But to do that, we have to work now. Thank you.
Let me remind you, if you have questions, if you would fill out the cards, they'll be collected, and we'll try to give a maximum opportunity to do that. Henry, do you want to make anything of a rebuttal of any of the points made?
I actually want to thank both discussants for very constructive comments. I would like to mention just a couple of factual points about the specific proposal I suggested. With respect to the issue of whether it cuts benefits, the plan that I put forward in the benefit formula would sustain benefits for everyone with averaged indexed annual earnings up to $100,000. There would be some benefit cuts above that level. I think in light of the trends in longevity, that kind of a change, it would also fatten benefits significantly for those with low average indexed earnings. Also, another factual point, the proposal I put forward would leave benefits of divorced spouses unchanged. It would leave widows' benefits unchanged. It would affect benefits of married couples who were both alive and receiving benefits. And Jason, I wish that it were true that prospects were good for legislating on Social Security before 2021. But it's certainly not going to be in this calendar year. And I think it's not a closely held secret that as of January 2019, the 2020 presidential campaign will be in full swing. So I think the prospects before that election are close to nil. I agree with you that everybody should be talking and thinking about how they want to proceed. But legislation is a first year of the next administration hope. That's what I think we should be aiming for.
So we have a few questions. I think the first one is implicitly directed at you, Jason. Will Republicans, that's just why I thought it might be directed, will Republicans' credibility on the deficit be damaged by the consequence of the tax cut, parentheses, adding $1.5 trillion to the deficit?
Now, that's a big, the best answer in economics is depends. If people start seeing in February or March a nice big bump in their take-home pay from the tax cut once withholding tables get released, they might not even notice the deficit, unfortunately. I do think on a political standpoint, for those who pay attention to politics and discuss it, that abandoning the fiscal responsibility to try to keep deficits and debt down does hurt the Democrats, the Republicans in the long term. And it reminds me of a joke I learned when I was working for Congress. The party of fiscal responsibility is the party in the minority.
I think all of you should address this one. If the cap is removed on taxable earnings, would we have to add another lower bend point to reflect the benefit earned by taxing all of payroll? Where are you on that? And by the way, Henry, you're not proposing the complete elimination of the cap. You're just saying get it to where it covered more earnings. Nancy, though, I understand you would abolish the cap completely?
I would put in a lot of more, that only makes proportionate revenue. I would bring in progressive revenue, the state tax, surtax on millions.
All right, so what about the issue, though, if you raise the cap, you have to alter the bend point to reflect some return on the additional contributions?
Yeah.
Well, for what it's worth, in the proposal I put forward, there is another bend point above the current 15% one at 5%. So there is some return, but not a huge amount. There's a fundamental point here. I'm a progressive, but I'm a progressive who believes that taxable capacity is limited in the sense that the American public has limited willingness to pay additional taxes. Tax limitations were a founding principle of this nation. And that means we have to be careful in how we use the limited tax capacity that is available for accomplishing a wide diversity of objectives. The principle in Social Security that it is a benefit that is based on your work, the taxes you paid, and those earnings that you are taxed on are the ones that are used for computing your benefits. It seems to me is a very important insight that dates back to Roosevelt and that we should not lose sight of. It's an enduring asset of the system. It's a political asset. It's an asset in principle because people can say, go and cash that check and not feel that they are receiving public largesse, whatever the facts are of the replacement. So I think it's important to recognize any additional earnings that are subject to tax in the benefit formula, but we have to recognize that the capacity to tax is limited, and consequently the amount that is spent on added benefits for people who are living longer, receiving higher earnings than the rest of the population is something that justifies a lower replacement rate.
And just acknowledging that our ability to tax is limited. Are you sure that makes you a progressive? It sounds like you've joined the vast right-wing conspiracy, Henry. Welcome,
No,
by the way. I'm glad to have you as part of the
actually, you need to read what progressives have been writing for a long time.
I think it's been held hostage to some other political passions these days. To the question, though, Social Security is an earned benefit, and that's been one of the foundational strengths of the program. If you lift the cap on covered wages so that there's no cap, so not just lift it, but raise it completely and get rid of it, lift it completely, then someone could get a really large Social Security check, $10,000, $12,000 a month. I think that wouldn't look very good for the program, whether Bill Gates is getting a large amount of money. So you'd either have to put another bend point in or just cap the benefit level at some point. That is whatever we decide to be reasonable, but you'd have to do that or else it wouldn't look very progressive.
And I agree with really both Henry and Jason about this principle that this is an earned benefit. And the majority of revenue for Social Security should come from worker contributions matched dollar for dollar by their employers, and they will. Under the trustees' report, at the end of the century, 75% of the funding is coming from that revenue. But starting in, there's always been investment income, and starting as part of the 1983 amendments, they introduced a progressive source of revenue, and that was the taxation of benefits paid back into the trust fund. Given the huge income and wealth inequality that we've seen over the last few decades, I think it is absolutely the correct policy. We've just cut all these taxes. You know, if you think it's overtaxing, just dedicate those taxes to restore them, dedicate those. That would more than be enough. So the point is that the worker contributions matched dollar for dollar. The wealthiest among us, most of their income is unearned income, not earned income, and we should require that some of that unearned income get contributed to Social Security as well.
We have one more. This is really a statement, and it asks for comments. One aspect of preventing the further erosion of public support is to explain that a well-functioning Social Security system benefits all generations. If parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, list every relative imaginable, receive adequate benefits, helps the younger generation by relieving a personal obligation. Comments?
Can I go first and go down?
We'll go down the list.
So first, to Henry, I wasn't saying we wait till 2021. I wanted to do it earlier, not legislatively, but to get the group together. Because I think you've been spending several months, if not more than a year or two, putting this proposal together. And for us to have something to be part of the presidential debate and be ready in 2021, we have to start working now together to get to a compromise. When it comes to generational issues, this has been one of my greatest concerns when we talk about equity. We always tend to talk about horizontal equity, like across groups, do like people get taxed in similar benefits. Progressively is vertical up or down to those who, do we have a progressive benefit formula? We forget the z-axis, which is generations. All of the reform plans I've seen basically hold benefits constant for those who are 50, 55 or above. But they raise taxes on today's workers. They also tend to lower or reduce benefit amounts going forward for today's workers, which means generationally, the Gen Xers, Gen Y, millennials are getting the short end of the stick both on the increased taxes and lower benefits. It's very hard to sell them on a solution to a program to say it's adequate for them when they're being asked to pay more and get less, which is also why we need to do something sooner rather than later.
I think I'll just let that statement stand as you read it.
Okay, I won't. I agree with the statement. Social Security, again, as we all in this room know, is an all-generation program. It's a family plan. It benefits the whole family. The architects of Social Security, those that created this, had a much broader vision when they called it Social Security. They started out with old age retirement benefits. They added survivor benefits. They always intended, along with long-term disability, that include short-term disability, that could include parental leave. It could, any of those kinds of caregiving, any of those where wages go down as a consequence of having to leave the workforce for a family reason. So that, and so we added long-term disability in 56, which was, they talked about in 35. We added Medicare in 65. They actually thought back in 1935 we were going to have universal health insurance in just a few years. We added people with disabilities to Medicare in 72, but that's when all additions stopped. And I think it's time we use the word expand, and it's carefully chosen, because the idea is to increase benefits that are too low, but to add protections that other industrialized countries have and that the working people of this country should have as well.
Please join me in thanking Henry, Jason, Nancy. And I hope you all agree that this is the Academy at its best, to be able to start a robust discussion about a sensitive issue. That is a politically charged issue. Now, Jason, as a board member, made a plea to all of you who want to contribute brain power to whatever might come out of this. As the CEO, I have to ask if any of you want to contribute dollars and help fund this. That's something we would definitely appreciate too. And yes, a future treasurer likes that comment. A couple of housekeeping items. You've been reminded each time those evaluation forms are vital to our assessing the conference, so please fill them out after each session. You'll have a 15-minute break, and we will, actually, it's probably now an 11-minute break. Panel 4, Economic Security for Non-Standard Workers in Retirement and Disability, will commence exactly at 2. And I believe those are the only housekeeping matters. So we'll see you back in about 10 minutes. And all the new refreshments, replenished refreshments, are in that room. So we'll see you back in about 10 minutes.